I was elbow-deep in soil, my hands smelling of earth and the soft, sugary ghost of the Queen Elizabeth roses. Elanor insisted on growing along the back border when James Morton's call came. The sun was low and the garden was quiet, the kind of dusk that seemed to press the sound of the house into a hush. I remember thinking how she always said roses liked an audience. Then the phone buzzed against the clay of my potting bench, and, in the polite cadence of someone trained to deliver bad news, James told me my aunt had died. He asked me to come to his office that afternoon. He didn't say it then, but he didn't have to. I knew. Elanor had been both the kind of woman you forget is fragile and the kind you expect to outlast the rest of us. She'd outlived several husbands, 2 economies, and more than a few grudges. She taught me how to hide things in plain sight. A trick with a jewelry box when I was 8. The way she slid small notes under the lining so the drawer looked ordinary, but kept secrets safe. It was not only a habit, it was part of the way she loved, careful and private and slightly theatrical. James handed me 2 envelopes on a leather blotter that still smelled faintly of his grandfather's pipe. One was the formal will, a crisp, unsigned document that called me by name, signed in her hand, bequeathing her estate, and, most shockingly, the controlling interest of Montgomery Industries, the empire everyone in town used to say Elanor built, but that everyone also assumed had been passed down in a less dramatic fashion. The number that sat in the corner of the paper was there without flourish, 89 million, written the way she might have recited it across tea and a ledger, a tidy but heavy thing. The second envelope was smaller, cream and softened at the edges, sealed with a circle of red wax impressed by a tiny rose. James set it on the blotter and looked at me like he was afraid the paper might combust at any moment. He told me, plainly and without dramatics, that my aunt left very precise instructions. I was to read the smaller letter, the one tucked inside that cream envelope, aloud at her funeral with the family present. That single sentence landed like a stone thrown into a still pond. Ripples of questions spread, and then I heard myself say the only thing that felt like a correct answer. I would do as she asked. There was a memory then, as clear as the scent of lemon oil. Elanor at the kitchen table teaching me the jewelry box trick. "Make it ordinary, Liv," she said, winking, tapping the velvet lining. "People overlook the ordinary." She pressed a thumb into the wood, slid the false bottom, and produced a coin the size of my palm. As a child, I thought she was performing magic. As an adult, I recognized it as her ethics. Important things deserve to be hidden until they must be seen. Before the funeral, before the cathedral, before faces I hadn't seen in years condensed into a museum of grief, I went back to her Victorian house. The place smelled like old paper and vanilla, like the perfume she favored that always seemed to linger over the piano in the parlor. The house, with its bay windows and steep roof, felt smaller than I expected. Elanor had filled it with the sort of accumulations that give people their texture. Botanical prints, leather-bound books, photographs of people in hats who were always smiling in the wrong way. Her study smelled additionally of cedar, and the shelves were set with the kind of precision gardeners take to pruning. Every book had its place, every paper a margin and a purpose. I found the jewelry box in the top drawer of her bedside table, exactly where her hand had taught mine to look. The lining had that old, familiar moth-breath softness, and there in the false compartment was the cream envelope, wax slightly cracked at the edge as if it had been handled 1,000 times. Attached to it was a note in her hand, the loops of her E and the stubborn tail of her R. "To be read at the funeral, with the family present," she had written. She'd made it nearly ceremonial, the wax seal, the careful instruction. There was a temptation, sudden and not shameful, to slit the wax and read everything then and there in the hush of her study, to know the truth before the cathedral and before the cousins who might find loopholes in it. To be honest, the temptation felt like a kind of love, an attempt to spare people the public shock I imagined. But that is not how Eleanor's love worked. I had learned her rules. I pressed the envelope back into the velvet niche and closed the box. I left it sealed. It's odd how family gathers when a will appears to promise something tangible. Phones started buzzing faster than prayers. My father texted first because he always texted first at moments that mattered and at moments that did not. His message was short and sharp. Call me. Later there were slower, sharper messages from cousins, John and Rebecca, their words polite as knives. If you know anything, say it now, Rebecca wrote at 1 a.m, as if the act of knowing could be sold in full sentences. There were other small ripples. Distant relatives who had not so much as worn Eleanor's funeral suit in 20 years, suddenly volunteering to arrange flowers, old employees offering condolences, and memories of promotions and pensions. That was the part of the inheritance that felt most complicated to me. The company isn't an object you can put under glass. Its names on pay stubs, and the women who baked the holiday cakes, and the engineers who showed up for a machine at 2 a.m. It is, in the end, a community. At St. Michael's Cathedral the day she was buried, the stone was cool beneath the cathedral's arches, and the air had the particular hush that makes sound bend into private things. The pews were full. People from the town filled the aisles, employees in their Sunday best, professors who had once argued with Elanor about patent law, her old housekeeper, Mrs. Peters, who sat with hands folded as if clasping a prayer she'd been practicing for years. My family was together in a block that felt like porcelain braced next to a window. My father's jaw had a tremor to it. John and Rebecca wore that quick fatigue people wear when they are prepared to bargain. My Uncle James stood a little off, his face older than I remembered, his hands worried into one another. When the time came, I walked to the lectern with Eleanor's cream envelope in my palm. My fingers found the wax seal and the little indentation of a rose she'd impressed when she'd ordered it sometime in the last winter. People often say that reading something aloud transforms it. It turns a private arrangement into a public fact. Standing there, I felt the truth of that in my chest like a stone. I broke the seal. The letter began with a voice I knew as certainly as my own, meticulous yet oddly tender, razor-steeled to do what kindness cannot. Elanor did not ask for drama. She offered clear, small statements. She explained that Montgomery Industries was not the simple birthright many assumed. She wrote that she had co-founded the company in the early days with a man named Harold Bennett, a pragmatic engineer who never wanted to stand in the light, but who built the machines and the procedures that, in their bones, kept the company afloat. There were photographs in the envelope, Harold with grease on his palms and a crooked grin, a younger Elanor beside him holding blueprints, an old factory with a sign that read, Montgomery and Bennett, Precision Works. In one photograph, Harold's arm was around a little girl with braids, her face blurred from movement. I only later learned the girl's name, Sarah. The letter continued with a paragraph that read like a line drawn in the sand. After Harold's death, what had been recorded as an accident, certain documents had been forged. Shares had been transferred away from Bennett's estate. The envelope contained copies, contracts with marginalia that did not match Harold's handwriting, bank statements with deposits that lined up with names I recognized, an early shareholder registry with Harold's name crossed out and replaced. There was an old police photograph of a car on the roadside. A margin note suggested the brakes had been tampered with. The documents did not point to a legal verdict. They pointed, with compelled insistence, to a theft of credit and ownership. Elanor wrote that she had spent decades building a cushion around Montgomery Industries because she feared what would happen to thousands of employees if the roof over their heads came crashing down under a public scandal. She said plainly that her silence was not peaceable. It was a calculation. She had let the company grow. She had filled it with loyal mid-level executives and plant managers who were not to blame for the crimes of the past. She had watched the wrongs accrue a kind of hardness like old varnish on wood. She had wanted to sand that away before anyone learned how dirty the boards underneath were. In the same paragraph she admitted, with a brevity that felt like confession, that she knew the truth had a cost. It might split families. It might cause reputational collapse. It might ruin lives. But she had come to believe that the moral correction due to Harold Bennett and his descendants could not be postponed forever. The company had to be strong enough to survive the truth. The truth, she wrote, would be told at the last time possible with me, by me, in front of everyone. She bequeathed 30% of Montgomery Industries to Sarah Bennett. She left the controlling interest, the rest, to me because she trusted, in that small sentence she had tucked into the margin of a life, that I would do the one thing she could not do, make restitution without wrecking the lives of those who had no part in the original theft. As I read, I watched the cathedral change. The first sounds were small, the rustle of hymn books, the soft, incredulous intake of breath. Then a murmur thread wove through the room, a low animal sound that turned toward my father's block. His face changed color, as if someone had peeled him like a fresh fruit. He stood up too quickly, dizzy perhaps with the magnitude of what I was saying, or with the anger that came because words rearranged his history into something strange. My Uncle James reached across and caught him, steadying him as if to keep him upright in the midst of a storm. I could see the lines at the corners of my cousins' mouths draw tight with anger. I could see John make a show of smoothing his suit. Rebecca's hand flew to her mouth the way people do when they are trying to swallow speech. Mrs. Peters, who had been the steady seamstress of our gatherings for years, blinked and squeezed the hand of the women sitting beside her. After I finished reading, there was a silence so complete it felt like an insult. Then questions rose into the vaulted space, sharp, incredulous, and not all of them polite. "Who else knew?" someone asked. An employee muttered a plea for honesty and an explanation. A few of Eleanor's old friends looked at me with that peculiar mixture of sorrow and accusation that people reserve for heirs who keep secrets. My father sank into his chair and covered his face. I saw his shoulders shudder. He did not collapse physically, so much as the weight of the years seemed to press on him in a way I had not seen before. Later, I would learn that he had been part of Montgomery's inner circle once, decades ago, and that he had carried around a loyalty that had blurred into complicity. Standing there, watching him, I felt a grief for the fact that secrets do not spare even the most reluctant accomplices. At the reception after the funeral, the cathedral's carpets muffled footsteps, and the air seemed to taste of sympathy folded into suspicion. People separated themselves into small groups, those who demanded a police inquiry immediately, and those who said, quietly, that exposing the past now would be like opening a drain on a house whose foundation we were still depending on. The argument was not simply legal, it was moral. We were balancing restitution against the livelihoods of ordinary people who had nothing to do with what had happened 30 years ago. Elanor had chosen to make the truth public at a time when the company, she believed, could weather the storm. But storms have gusts that hit unexpected places. I found Sarah in the corner of the parish hall, her hands folded around a cup of tea like it might break beneath her fingers. She did not know me at first. Few people did. She had the same stubborn line of Harold's jaw in her face and a cautious, practical gaze. For a long while we just sat across from one another and let the noise of the reception grow and fold. Neither of us wanted the spectacle of a confrontation. Finally, she said, "He was my father. He built things so other people could afford to keep their hands clean." Her voice was small, not angered but emptied. Someone had stolen not only an edge of recognition, but the real inheritance owed to the person who had, by all accounts in the photographs and notes, done the work itself. We did not speak in the rhetorical language of reform in that first hour. There was no grand theorizing, no slogan-making. We had grief and documents between us, and the practical sense that whatever happened next would need to be measured if it was to be just. We agreed to read everything Elanor had left. We agreed to meet with the old accountants who had been loyal to her, and with people who knew how to make companies more than machines that turn profit. We agreed, quietly and without ceremony, that restitution and stewardship were not mutually exclusive. Outside the hall, the family fracture deepened. There were raised voices in the parking lot, and a few sharp public denials from those who had once benefited from the ways the company had pivoted over decades. "This is opportunism," someone said loudly, fully intending for the words to land. "Who is she to take the company and hand it over?" Another voice answered that the truth ought to be known regardless of discomfort. My father, for all his imperfections, slipped away into the fog of the next few days, as if trying to make himself small enough to be forgiven. He went into rehab of sorts, not for alcohol, or not only for alcohol, but for the ways men like him quietly build their lives on the edges of other people's misfortune. He called me once, his voice a sandpapered whisper, and said, "I didn't stop it." He did not say more. That was all the confession I received. Publicly, there were questions. Internally, within Montgomery, managers worried about stock volatility and employee pensions and the kind of practical things that cannot be repaired with an apology. Elanor had left enough paper to make the case. She had left photographs and bank records and a few forensic notes she'd had copied and placed in the envelope. I did not pretend these small pages would be all anyone needed. They were a catalyst, not a verdict. They made possible a narrative that could no longer be smoothed into silence. When we presented the documents to the company board and to senior staff, there was shock and then a kind of industrious resolve. People who had worked for Montgomery for decades did not want their livelihoods gambled on a scandal. They wanted a path forward that honored the past but did not ruin the present. Sarah and I spent long months talking to town leaders, to unions, to the plant managers who had kept the assembly lines running. We did not do it with a PR campaign. We did it over coffee and at late-night meetings where the light was always too harsh, and someone would invariably say something that made everyone else rub the bridge of their nose. Economically, we made no miraculous pronouncements. There were no dramatic courtroom scenes in which villains were dragged to light by the sheer force of truth. Some people wanted that. Some people wanted to see the family member implicated named and shamed. The documents had implicated a member of the Montgomery family who had been a partner and who had benefited from the transfers of shares. That is an uncomfortable sentence to have to stand by in public, because it is both an accusation and an unfinished sentence. There were no convictions in the envelope, only the kind of evidence moral systems sometimes use to start a conversation, and legal systems sometimes use to file a claim. The outcomes that followed were matters for investigations, and for the breathless speculation of town gossip. What I could do, and what Elanor had entrusted me to do, was to steward the company in a way that would make restitution meaningful. We negotiated with Sarah, who accepted the 30% share not like a prize, but like a responsibility. It came with pressure. The knowledge that she now stood as the living heir to a man whose name had been obscured from the company's ledger for decades. She wanted, quietly and without fanfare, to be sure her father's contribution was visible, not only in words, but in policy. Named scholarships, a leadership institute in Harold's name for engineers from underrepresented backgrounds, a permanent plaque at the manufacturing plant. She wanted the company to remember where its bones came from, in a way that moves beyond tokenism. Months passed. The initial shock settled into a longer, quieter rhythm of rebuilding. We retooled the company culture to include more transparency in records, to make sure that histories were not permitted to unspool into fiction. We instituted, simply and practically, moments where old documents were reviewed and histories were written down, where we made spaces for those who worked in the factory to have a voice in decisions that affected them. We did not call it restitution and then pretend that the ledger was clean. We called it attention. Attention does not erase harm, but without it, harm calcifies. My father emerged from his low period altered. He came to the plant one afternoon and stood with his hands in his pockets like someone afraid to take up space. He spoke publicly once, in front of a small group of employees, and offered an apology that was clumsy and not entirely complete, but it was more than silence. He did not ask for absolution. He did not expect it. He asked instead what he could do. Later, privately, he told me that he would spend the rest of his life trying to be less wrong. I do not know that this is a satisfying ending for anyone. People make peace in different ways. For him, it meant small acts, a tendency to give credit where it was due, and to stop accepting ribbons when others had done the hard sewing. There were loud, performative responses from the family. John and Rebecca moved quickly to litigate, or at least to threaten it, their lawyers pressing for immediate control. There were press kits assembled by people who had once called Elanor friend, and now called her decisions reckless. But the company did not collapse. It had, by the time the lid was lifted, enough ballast in the form of long-standing contracts and a workforce that believed in its mission. That was Eleanor's calculation. And it was a gamble she took with the knowledge that truth sometimes requires a stage and sometimes requires patience. The employees' loyalty mattered. Their livelihoods mattered more than the family's bruised pride. Working with Sarah was a surprise in the best way. She was practical where I could be sentimental, blunt where I could be sly. Our partnership was not a pact between two eager heirs, but rather a slow building of a shared mission. She insisted on clarity measures, of making historical records accessible, of instituting a remembrance fund to honor Harold's engineering scholarship, of setting aside resources to support employees who needed retraining as new technologies arrived. In staff meetings, we argued like siblings who had not grown up together, but were trying, desperately, to invent a family ethic. Once, after a long day of presentations, she said, "Your aunt wanted this to be painful enough to be meaningful. She also wanted it to be gentle enough to preserve what is good." I laughed then, because the sentence both insulted and complimented me in the exact proportion of Eleanor's colors. The rose garden remained the place I retreated to at dawn when the world felt too wooden for the soft logic I needed. The Queen Elizabeth roses, which are not easy to grow in our wind, unfurled like someone shaking out a long-forgotten scarf. I often came with a cup of coffee cooling in my hands and sat on the little stone bench where Elanor used to read aloud from the Times. One morning, as sunlight gilded the ridges of petals, I found a small folded note tucked between the stems. It was my aunt's handwriting, of course. She had the curious habit of writing marginal comments as if life itself were a footnote. Her final personal note was the most intimate because it contained nothing legal, no photocopied document, no instruction. It was short and in that pansy slight way she had when she forgave herself in ink. "You have always been the one to do what is hard because you love what is fragile," she wrote. "Do not let anger guide the work. Let repair. Let patience. Let the roses remind you. Beauty grows out of dark soil when someone cares enough to root it." I sat on the bench and read it 3 times before the coffee grew cold. Do not misunderstand me. The story did not end because of a note. Reconfiguration is a long, unromantic process. There were spreadsheets and meetings and angry phone calls. There were days when the press made the company's history into a caricature of greed and melodrama. There were moments when I thought I had overreached simply by keeping the faith that a company could be more than property. But slowly, not perfectly, never exactly as I imagined, we began to see the edges smooth. The scholarship for engineers bore Harold's name. A new memorial plaque joined the names on the factory wall. Employees whose grandfathers had worked on the assembly line came to a modest ceremony where they were given a clearer history of how the plant had been built and by whom. One late afternoon, Sarah and I walked the plant floor together, side by side, and someone called Harold's name. It was not a triumphal cry, but a small, necessary recognition. People looked at us, not with the rigid expectation of a tidy ending, but with a practical curiosity about whether this would change anything for them. The question of whether justice had been done was one the newspapers wanted to answer in one neat paragraph. The workers wanted to know if their pensions were safe tonight, if their children would have breakfast tomorrow, if anyone would care if the assembly line halted. We did not have all the answers. We had, however, a plan and the will to make the plan honest. Months later, in the waning light of another day in the garden, I opened the study drawer and found one final thing I hadn't expected. A single photograph, creased at the corners. It was Elanor and Harold on a porch that might have been the factory's, smiles not posed, but caught in the middle of making someone else laugh. Behind them stood a younger man I thought might have been one of the early partners. The photograph, for me, settled something like a last bone into place. The past was not tidy. It had edges. It had people who were both villains and victims, because life rarely allows neat categories. I planted a new row of Queen Elizabeth roses that spring, hand in the dark of the soil, and thought about what it means to steward something. Sometimes it is taking ownership. Sometimes it is handing it back. Sometimes it is the quieter work of teaching the next people how to tend. The roses do not care about our moral vocabulary. They respond to sun and pruning and attention. That mattered to Elanor, who learned early in the small precincts of a garden how to build something that could survive a winter. Her legacy arrived to me with a condition that felt at once theatrical and deeply moral. She did not ask me to be a hero. She asked me to be honest, to read the truth aloud with everyone present, and to bear the consequences with measured attention to those who had nothing to do with the original sin. That is the particular cruelty and generosity of conditional inheritance. It makes you choose between the private relief of silence and the public hardening of truth. Elanor chose the latter in a way that forced me to choose too. When I tell this story now, to friends over coffee, to new employees learning the company's odd and carefully fought history, I often think of her hands in the velvet of that jewelry box. She taught me that important things should be hidden until the moment they are required. She also taught me that hiding is not always protection. Sometimes the most loving act is to make the truth audible so that repair is possible. What followed her letter was not an easy symphony of reparation. It was long work, an unbridleable lifting of small stones, a patient, sometimes exasperating reweaving of a community's story. If this story has gripped you so far, there are more like it. Stay with me, subscribe, and you'll hear other quiet reckonings and the way people turn them into repair. In the meantime, if you are sitting with a family secret or a heavy inheritance of your own, take a walk in a garden first. Sometimes the soil will tell you whether the roots are ready for light. Eleanor's last note, the private one in the garden, closed with a small mischievous addendum that I think is very like her. If you have to make trouble, make beautiful trouble. Always plant roses. I have tried to keep that as a rule. There are decisions you can make out of rage, and decisions you can make out of a weary, patient love for what is left behind. I learned that the two are not the same. The company we now lead does not proclaim itself a monument to rightness. It is instead a place where history is acknowledged, where appropriation is not dismissed as a mistake, but named and corrected in the small ways a living institution can correct a wound, by reassigning shares, by funding memorials, by setting aside resources for education, by making sure names are not erased from registries for convenience. That is not perfect restitution. No single act could undo a stolen life. It is, however, the kind of repair that might prevent future thefts, and might, in small ways, honor the work of a man who preferred machines to limelight. Sometimes, when the dusk lays gentle over the rose garden, and I breathe in the vanilla smell that seems to follow Elanor even from beyond the hedge, I think about inherited duty and the strange, narrow ways we are asked to carry it. The biggest lesson she left me was not about money or power. It was about the discipline of truth, to tell it when it matters, to measure how many people will be hurt by silence, and to act regardless of whether applause follows. She chose to build a company that could weather shame, so it could then become the instrument of correction. If this brought something up for you, a conversation you need to have, or a truth you have kept private, share it with someone who will take it with care. Leave your comments below. I'd like to know how you think restitution can be done well. For me, the roses in that garden are not only memory, they are a promise. They remind me that beauty can come after truth, if we do the slow work of tending the soil.